LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the July 10th edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 11 best, most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which would be really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all today. As you can see from my video title, the main topic I will be covering is Biden showcases successful Ukraine policy as he sends cluster bombs. Biden is showcasing his foreign policy in general this week. He's going to this NATO summit, mostly discussing Ukraine, also discussing China, Russia, and as part of Ukraine, and making this somewhat controversial decision to send these cluster bombs. They're like bombs that drop like thousands of bomblets, some of which don't explode immediately and can be picked up by civilians years, even decades later. I think there's a whole bunch of unexploded cluster bombs in Laos that the United States left there. And so it can be, if you use cluster bombs on civilian populations, it can be considered a war crime even. Russia's been using them in Ukraine, but Ukraine wants them, and I'll be discussing that decision in detail with several different guests commenting on it, including the Ukrainian ambassador. If you look down in the video description, I have brief descriptions or brief summaries of all the clips. And if you go down to clip 9, you'll see Ukrainian ambassador Oksana Markarova talks about why Ukraine wants to use these cluster bombs on their own territory. And so I'll get to Ukraine policy and how it is something that the Biden administration has generally done well, but probably won't help the Biden administration very much politically, because foreign policy, at least as the conventional wisdom is, that foreign policy could hurt the Biden administration if things go wrong, but not necessarily help when things go right. And you'll see NBC News Meet the Press panel discussion specifically on that topic. But I want to start with my political comedy is not on the main topic. It's this story I saw on Fox News last week. And the top story last week was cocaine found in the White House. I was really surprised that wasn't covered on Fox News Sunday. I'm not sure why it wasn't, but the other thing they like to cover a lot is woke corporations getting losing money because of the backlash. And the story they had on Friday was about Ben & Jerry's and their 4th of July tweet supposedly losing the money, but even like their own analyst could not really support the conclusion that they're trying to make you draw here, and it's all pretty ridiculous, and for like 2 or 3 different reasons that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that political comedy clip from, this is supposedly straight news, Aisha Hosni, the reporter, Bill Hemmer, Dagan McDowell is more of a commentator, but she's on a straight news program, and there's like nobody really telling you the truth. I'll tell you the truth after we watch that clip together over here.
Okay, so Ben & Jerry's back at it again, celebrating Independence Day by throwing a bucket of cold water on our nation's history. The ice cream giant posting this tweet claiming that the U.S. was founded on stolen indigenous land and calling for its return. Well, that sparked calls for a boycott on the ice cream company, and Ben & Jerry's parent company Unilever stock lost $2.5 billion with a B in market cap value. Let's bring in Fox Nation host Abby Hornacek and Dagan McDowell, co-host of The Bottom Line on Fox Business, to talk about this. So I just want to pull up for everybody at home call for number 1. This is how companies' profits have really taken a huge hit after they've gone woke. And you can see $2.5 billion for Unilever, Bud Light $19.8 billion. We all watched that happen live. Target $13.9 billion, The North Face $200 million. It goes on. So, Dagan, there's been a shift in people. You know, it used to be you could get away with these tactics. People rolled their eyes. and then move on and keep eating ice cream. But now people have had enough. What has changed?
Just out of, to be fair, that's market value, so that's just how much the stock fell.
Market cap.
And yesterday, the stock of Unilever, this is an Anglo-Dutch giant, it's got about 400 brands. It fell about as much as the market yesterday. So it was kind
At
of
130 billion and went to 128 billion.
It fell 0.8%. However, they knew when they bought Ben & Jerry's 23 years ago what they were getting with this uninformed moralizing. They have lots of issues, shall we say. But in this day and age, if this Ben & Jerry's is going to preach some hard truths, how about starting with obesity is our business? We are a problem, not a solution, when diabetes is plaguing the United States and the world. Ben & Jerry's should start there. And Unilever has had problems with Ben & Jerry's in the past when Ben & Jerry's refused to sell ice cream in the Israeli settlements built on the West Bank. And they tried to hide that, cover it up, do some restructuring at Unilever, lump Ben & Jerry's in with Klondike and Breyers, and then they sold the brand to a local Israeli licensee who started selling the ice cream again, and then Ben & Jerry's sued them. So
they kind of knew what they were getting into.
You know what?
Abby.
Buy local.
Yeah, got it. Cookies and cream?
No, I personally don't like Ben & Jerry's because there's too much stuff in there. But, you know,
So yeah, you saw that Dagan McDowell there kind of like gave away the total spin in that story when you said, well, the market went down and it also went down about the same amount, but it's even worse than that. It's even, they're like making this whole argument that woke corporations lose money for being woke, like Ben & Jerry's doesn't already have that built into their brand anyway. That's like totally the Ben & Jerry's brand forever. So that was ridiculous. Like, and it's a very small part of Unilever, which I saw this MarketWatch story that same day. There's a link down to this article in the video description. Unilever outperforms market despite losses on the day. So Unilever actually did better than the rest of the market, which... So even what Dagan McDowell there was saying about how, well, it lost money like the market lost money, well, it actually lost less of a percentage. So the evidence actually shows that, I mean, if you're going to assume this tweet is associated with what happened in the stock market for Unilever, that it actually benefited Unilever to have the woke Ben & Jerry's brand tweeting out about stolen land, which, of course, is actually true. This whole country was taken from indigenous people, so I don't know why that's so controversial either. And to like round out, well, I mean, there are a couple other reasons it's ridiculous. Well, first of all, it's because this is now going to be one of the points that Fox News research has shown that woke corporations lose money. You saw, here's like this screenshot from that comedy clip, that Fox News bias clip I just showed. They have Unilever losing 2.5 billion, Bud Light, Disney losing, like, what day did Disney lose 18.1 billion? Target, that's because of Pride. But the thing that also, the final point I want to make as to why this is so ridiculous is because the other half of the time on Fox News, they're always talking about cancel culture, like people who are getting canceled or getting economic damage because they have opinions that aren't popular or whatever. So like half the time they're complaining about cancel culture, and then the other half the time they're trying to cancel woke corporations that have opinions that they don't like, and promoting boycotts. And I mean, the whole thing is kind of comical and ridiculous, and that's why I chose it as my political comedy clip. But now I want to get to my main topic with the news summaries, but the first and longest news summary is not on the main topic. It's NBC News' Meet the Press, where later I'm going to show you they had a panel discussion that seemed like it might have happened on Sunday. But the rest of the program is like another one of these ones where Chuck Todd, he's leaving the program in September, and he's like seems to be pre-recording the program a lot of weeks. He went to North Dakota to talk to this one Republican presidential, talk to the governor who's running for president now, and you'll see that they actually skew their news coverage to be about the 2024 presidential election, not really covering the NATO summit or the uh, trip to China by the Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen that is the main topic of a lot of the other news summaries here. But it's mostly because Governor Doug Burgum is his exclusive guest, I guess, maybe why he's focusing on that. And it's really more about, like, is it going to be economic issues or culture war issues that define the 2024 presidential election, which, again, isn't really all that breaking news for a Sunday morning news analysis show. That's my criticism of Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, and I'll talk about it a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
And a good Sunday morning to all of you out there. With the Iowa caucuses just 6 months away, mark your calendars for January 15th, officially, by the way. The two parties are debating what the coming campaign is going to be about, the intensifying culture wars or a referendum on the economy. President Biden is hoping to claim credit for what is an improving economy. He's ramping up a messaging tour focused on the economic agenda that he is embracing and calling Bidenomics. Inflation has dropped for 11 straight months, from a high of 9.1% in June of last year to 4% this May. Unemployment stands at 3.6%. That is near a 50-year low. And 13 million jobs have been added since Biden took office. We've completely recovered from the pandemic drop. But the American public is not feeling it. Just 34% of Americans approve of Biden's handling of the economy in a recent AP poll that was released at the end of June. And only 20% of voters believe the nation is on the right track, though voters have not felt good about the direction of the country for over a decade. And Biden is trying to persuade voters that the economy is better than they think it is.
And guess what? Bidenomics is working.
I'm not here to declare victory on the economy. I'm here to say we have a plan that's turning things around quickly. It's about growing the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. Today's job shows that, jobs report shows that Bidenomics is working.
Now, this is actually a familiar pivot for incumbent Democratic presidents in the last 30 years. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had to make the case that their economic policies were working to a skeptical public as they were vying for a second term. And it's a necessary pivot for the Biden campaign. But ultimately, it could end up being that the culture war issues, like abortion, that Democrats end up rallying around, especially as the Republican Party continues to focus even more time on cultural issues.
School bureaucrats do not know better than parents. We've got to go and defeat them from the ground up and let them know that we are not going to have this indoctrination in there.
We are going to end men joining women's teams.
Identifying Donald Trump as really being a pioneer in injecting gender ideology into the mainstream, where he was having men compete against women in his beauty pageants.
And in fact, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's trailing Donald Trump by 30 points in many national primary matchups, continues to try to run to the right of Trump on these social issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights. In fact, this week, DeSantis' rapid response team reposted a video on Twitter attacking Trump for formally expressing support for the LGBTQ community. The video was criticized even by Republicans and has since been taken down. Now, one Republican candidate, who is already outspending all of his rivals right now in advertising in Iowa and New Hampshire, is betting that there is a lane for a Republican candidate that is solely focused on the economy and national security rather than on what he calls anti-wokeness. On Friday, I traveled to Fargo, North Dakota, and I sat down with the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum. He's a
and I'm not going to have a clip of that because he never really discusses foreign policy. He doesn't discuss Ukraine. I don't think he mentions, he certainly didn't discuss cluster bombs because that was, did he discuss Ukraine at all with Doug Burgum? I don't think so, but not till Oh no, he does talk about it with him briefly. No, no, no. Yeah, anyway. Uh, so that's why I kind of came to the conclusion that some of it was pre-recorded or it didn't really cover the breaking news as much as the other news summaries. I mean, you can tell me what you think after. And what I was looking at there is one of the things I do is I can actually read the transcripts of the programs. Uh, For example, you can see here, I'll put in the chat for if anyone's interested. Uh, that's the transcript of Meet the Press there that I was just looking through where I don't think he really did bring up Ukraine with the governor of North Dakota. He just mainly talked about economics and cultural issues. And anyway, the other news summaries are much more focused on the foreign policy issue, on what I think is the main topic from, Biden's foreign policy week and his NATO summit and Fox News Sunday. Actually, I don't think the news summary was that biased. I think Jacqui Heinrich did a pretty good job of pretending to be a straight news journalist in this report. You could tell me if you find extra bias. I found some bias in the interview I'll show you later with Shannon Bream, but Jacqui Heinrich, I think, did an okay job this week for Fox News Sunday. No mention of cocaine at the White House. Like I said, that was my big surprise. Didn't show up on Fox News Sunday, but anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch the Fox News Sunday news summary together over here.
Hello from Fox News in Washington. President Biden departs for Europe this hour as he readies for a pivotal overseas trip centered around a meeting with NATO leaders. The main focus for the White House, next steps in Ukraine and pressing to expand the alliance to include Sweden, whose membership has been blocked by Turkey and Hungary. In a moment, we'll hear from two voices on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Wyoming's John Barrasso and Tim Kaine of Virginia. But first, let's turn to Jacqui Heinrich live in London ahead of the president's high-stakes meetings. Hello, Jacqui.
Good morning, Shannon. President Biden's three-nation trip begins in the UK, but the centerpiece of this visit is the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. The president's decision to supply Ukraine with cluster bombs, weapons banned in more than 120 countries, expected to feature prominently in the meetings.
It took me a while to be convinced to do it.
Russia's use of cluster bombs on Ukrainian soil since the beginning of the invasion, a key factor in President Biden's decision to ultimately supply them to Ukraine. But the Russian Foreign Ministry was quick to seize on the White House position from last year.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration?
We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime.
The weapons are considered risky because of their potential to leave unexploded bomblets behind that could cause future harm. But officials say the U.S. supply is less likely to do that than Russia's.
That area is going to have to be demined regardless. These are their citizens they're protecting.
Nevertheless, some NATO allies quickly opposed the move, including Canada, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Biden expected to make the case to the UK Prime Minister in London and again at the NATO summit, Ukraine cannot be left defenseless.
I think they needed them.
Also on the president's agenda, working to convince Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan to approve Sweden joining NATO.
I think you can expect that President Biden and President Erdogan will talk in Vilnius.
NATO leaders also expected to discuss what steps Ukraine would have to take to join.
President Biden's trip comes days after his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, arrived in Beijing to try to simmer U.S.-China tensions. Tomorrow, the president meets with King Charles for the first time since the English monarch was crowned. Shannon.
Jacqui Heinrich live in London. Jacqui, thank you. Joining us now from Wyoming, Republican Senator John Barrasso, member of the...
And I will have a clip of Shannon Bream's interview with Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming. And I don't know why all the upper states are getting the interviews. That there was Doug Burgum from North Dakota in the previous clip there. But John Barrasso's on the Foreign Relations Committee, and He is one of a wide range of people. Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential nominee for when Hillary Clinton ran in 2016, so a real establishment Democrat, also in favor of cluster munitions being sent to Ukraine. So you have like John Barrasso, far right from Wyoming, and then the more moderate left Senator Tim Kaine, who also supports the use of cluster bombs by Ukraine on its own territory. The only one who really opposed it, I'm going to show you this clip later, clip 7 coming up, will be Representative Barbara Lee from California, running for the Senate from California to replace Dianne Feinstein. She's like the only member of the House of Representatives to vote against the war in Afghanistan, and she actually opposes the use of the cluster bombs by Ukraine. I don't know if you noticed, I saw there was some discussion in the live comments as to whether Russia actually has used cluster bombs. Fox News just reported it. If you trust Fox News more than the other 4 networks that I show here, Fox News just said that the Russian use of cluster bombs in Ukraine was one of the key factors that led Biden to decide to send cluster bombs to Ukraine to use in their own territory. I also, earlier in the live comments, put a link to a Human Rights Watch report that had like dozens of citations at the end to the evidence that cluster bombs had been used by Russia. I don't know why that wasn't dispositive. I don't know why that's really a controversy. I mean, Russia uses cluster bombs. The U.S. actually has used cluster bombs. The U.S. is one of the non-signatories of the Geneva Convention against cluster bombs, but we also have been spending a lot of time cleaning up cluster bombs. I mean, it's definitely at most morally ambiguous to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. I almost want to side with Barbara Lee, but I think when you hear the Ukrainian ambassador in the clip, a couple clips after that, clip 9, when you hear Oksana Markova explain why to Margaret Brennan why Ukraine wants to use cluster bombs on their own territory, I mean, that seems to be the most dispositive answer to me. But anyway, before I get to that, I have to finish the news summaries. You'll see the next one is CNN's State of the Union. Very similar to the Fox News Sunday one, just half as long, covering most of the same stuff. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is wondering about long-term consequences just days after announcing his controversial decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine, a weapon his administration once referred to as constituting a potential war crime. President Biden is heading overseas this morning, where he and the larger NATO alliance will face a key test over whether they can remain united as they face down numerous thorny international challenges. Tomorrow, the president starts his trip in the UK, meeting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, then visiting with newly crowned King Charles III. Then it's off to Lithuania for what will undoubtedly be the trickiest part of the president's trip. 2 days of meetings with key NATO allies over Russia's war in Ukraine, the refusal of NATO members Turkey and Hungary to welcome Sweden into the NATO alliance, conflicting opinions on curbing China's growing influence. The meeting will require diplomatic deftness with questions about the end game in Ukraine and just exactly how committed NATO is to Ukraine winning the war, all while dealing with President Volodymyr Zelensky's calls to immediately admit Ukraine into NATO. Zelensky told my colleague Aaron Burnett this week that that decision is entirely up to President Biden. Biden told my colleague Fareed Zakaria that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO. Joining us now to discuss, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul, Republican of...
And I won't have a clip of Mike McCaul because I am going to show you Barbara Lee, the one person who said we shouldn't send the cluster bombs. But before I get to that, I have 2 more news summaries. One is a little over a minute. The other one's like 30 seconds. So let's just get through it. ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz this week, talking about her experience the first, 500 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. what it all means over in this
It
clip.
has now been 500 days since the first Russian missile strikes in Ukraine signaled the start of an invasion that most of the world expected would end in a victory for Vladimir Putin in a matter of days. I was on the ground in Ukraine that night, in a country fighting for its very survival, among citizens facing an uncertain future. I just returned from another trip to Ukraine, a nation still at war, its future still uncertain, but no longer just on the defensive. Its soldiers are now engaged in a grinding effort to reclaim occupied land, armed with equipment and training from the U.S.-led global coalition. It's a critical moment in this conflict. Ukraine's performance against the larger dug-in Russian force could determine the trajectory of a war that has left more than 9,000 civilians dead and forced 11 million Ukrainians, a quarter of the population, from their homes. With the counteroffensive in motion and ahead of President Biden's trip to Europe for the NATO summit, where leaders are expected to debate Ukraine's push to join the alliance, we met up with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
And I will have a clip, the final clip I'm going to show you. It's in some ways is my favorite clip. It's Volodymyr Zelensky, in my opinion, definitely taking a side in the 2024 presidential election, should it be Trump versus Biden, and specifically responding to this Trump claim, oh, if he was president, Trump, he would end the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 24 hours. He would have it would all be done in 24 hours. And Volodymyr Zelensky responds to what he thinks about that claim, and how Biden could make that claim, but is actually not making that claim because he has actually a successful Ukraine policy, unlike Trump, who had his first impeachment because of his dastardly deeds when it came to holding up aid to Ukraine to try to get them to dig up dirt on his political opponent. Open investigation. I don't care, what happens in the I just want to be able to say you opened an investigation. That was the whole point of that. And it's even like coming back now, that whole, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that whole FBI report that the Biden family took a $5 million bribe is just the whole debunked dirt on Biden that Trump was trying to get dug up by Zelensky back in the first impeachment. And I think Volodymyr Zelensky remembers all that and is much more comfortable with Joe Biden as president. And you can let me know what you think about that after we watch that final clip, clip 11. But we have one more news summary, and this is the shortest news summary. Face the Nation often does this, where they're basically just talking about two things. First, they mentioned this extreme heat, which, I don't know, maybe that was the biggest story last week, because like the 3 hottest days on Earth ever were last week, and the planet, this is all part of global warming. And Face the Nation, by the way, down in the video description under sources, you can go to the Face the Nation YouTube channel if you click on the link next to Face the Nation. And now for the last several weeks, they've been uploading the entire episode in full to their YouTube channel, so you can watch the whole thing, including their report on climate change. Maybe I should have covered that as the most important story, because 100 years from now, looking back, that's probably what they're going to think the most important story was this week, that the hottest days on record. So that, at least, I got to give CBS News Face the Nation kudos for putting that in the first 30 seconds of their program, though not much of a news summary otherwise over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We're going to take a closer look at the brutal heat that has settled in across the country during a later point in this broadcast. But this spoiler alert, the extreme weather is expected to intensify. Another issue that's heating up, trade disputes between the U.S. and China. Janet Yellen is the second cabinet secretary to make a goodwill mission to Beijing in the last few weeks. We spoke with her exclusively before she departed China. At the top of...
And actually, I'm not going to take the Janet Yellen clip or any Janet Yellen clips from that interview on Face the Nation, because I have the Ukrainian ambassador coming up. But now I'm getting to my newsmakers. I'm going to start off here with the Representative Barbara Lee clip that I talked about, where she sticks to her principles, as you would expect from Barbara Lee. I think I may support Barbara Lee for Senate in California. I haven't decided yet. There are various candidates. And then I'll have the Meet the Press panel discussion that really talks about how it's not going to hurt Biden to be in favor of these cluster bombs, even if people like Barbara Lee are against him, since the vast majority of the political spectrum supports the cluster bombs being sent to Ukraine. Then I'll show the Ukrainian ambassador giving the most persuasive answer why they want the cluster bombs to use on their own territory. Then I'll show you the John Barrasso clip, and then the Vladimir Zelensky clip, and then we'll be done with the program. So let's start with Barbara Lee giving the more left-wing peace activist. This, like I said, Barbara Lee is the only member of the House of Representatives to vote against the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 back in 2001, because she thought that it gave too much of a broad, long-lasting authority to the executive to conduct warfare, and she was totally right about that. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Here's how the White House is trying to justify giving Ukraine cluster munitions despite the risk that they pose to civilians. Take a listen.
There is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us. This is their country they're defending. These are their citizens they're protecting. And they are motivated to use any weapon system they have.
What do you think? Do you buy that argument? What's your response?
Nice being with you, Jake. No, cluster bombs should never be used. That's crossing a line. Once you see what takes place, we know what takes place in terms of cluster bombs being very dangerous to civilians. They don't always immediately explode. Children can step on them. That's a line we should not cross. I think the president's been doing a good job managing this war, this Putin aggressive war against Ukraine, but I think that this should not happen. He had to ask for a waiver under the Foreign Assistance Act just to do it, because we have been preventing the use of cluster bombs since, I believe, 2010.
So when Putin started using cluster bombs, the Biden White House said that would potentially be a war crime. Do you think that, therefore, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, will potentially be engaging in war crimes if this goes forward?
What I think is that we would risk losing our moral leadership, because when you look at the fact that over 120 countries have signed the Convention on cluster munitions, saying they should never be used. They should never be used. And in fact, many of us have urged the administration to sign on to this convention. And so I'm hoping that the administration would reconsider this, because these are very dangerous bombs. They're dangerous weapons. And this is a line that I don't believe we should cross.
So yeah, that was a very principled stance by Representative Barbara Lee. That's one of the things that's great about Representative Barbara Lee. Like I said, going all the way back to her vote against the war in Afghanistan in 2001, the only person to vote against the authorization of for use of military force, the AUMF as they call it, that is still being used to justify bombing people in the Middle East or even in Africa, and all sorts of drone attacks. It's like anyone who might be, it's way too broad, and Barbara Lee was completely right about that. And hopefully sometime soon Congress will repeal the authorization for use of military force from September 2001 that is still being used to fight wars today that we never even thought about 22 years ago or whatever. But in terms of the political implications, and also why this particular use of cluster bombs by Ukraine on its own territory is less morally repugnant than most uses of cluster bombs. For both those topics, I think the Meet the Press panel discussion gave you sort of the spectrum of political opinion, but people on the left, the right, more centrists, and of course corporatists like Chuck Todd, who introduces the whole discussion here. And this is like the most topical part of Meet the Press. Like I said, earlier, I have been criticizing Meet the Press for pre-recording a lot of the show recently, but this one seems pretty up to date. I'm not sure when this might have actually been recorded over the weekend. I don't know when Chuck Todd came back from Fargo, but this might have been recorded Sunday. I don't know. You can let me know what you think after we watch the panel discussion together over here.
President Biden did something that has a lot of anti-war activists upset. Frankly, has a lot of folks around the world upset. The decision to send over cluster munitions, Amna, to the Ukrainians. First, let me play President Biden's rationale for why he went ahead and agreed to do something that 100 countries have banned the use of. Ammunition in 100 countries have banned the use of. Take a listen to his explanation.
This is a war relating to munitions and the running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, took the recommendation of the Defense Department.
You know, Amna, he's actually giving voice to something that's been a running issue inside the Pentagon for about the last 3 months, which is the stockpiles are running down.
They are.
Around the entire West.
They are. And it's dangerous because they are burning through that ammunition faster than the U.S. and the alliance can resupply it. It's a real problem in what they have called a must-win war. Let's be clear about what these cluster munitions are, though, right? They basically spread a series of so-called bomblets over a huge area. Many of them do not detonate upon impact and then pose a severe, potentially
almost like
fatal
abandoned landmines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we know this has happened. There's been thousands of civilian deaths across the world or maimings across the world as a result of these. The U.S. themselves stopped using them back in 2003, by and large, by the way. So this speaks to both the desperation that we're facing on the front in Ukraine, also this particular moment in time where the counteroffensive is not going as well as they would like it to. Military folks I talked to say this could change the direction of the war, and they're already using these, so why not give Ukraine everything they want? And they did request these. But even some former military folks I've talked to said, look, there's going to be a long and dangerous cleanup after this war. We will deal with this after the fact.
Garrett, a few Democrats spoke out, sent out releases uncomfortable with this. Is this somehow going to impact support for the war, though?
I doubt it. I mean, the coalition of people in Congress and nationally, at least if you believe the polling, is still strongly in favor of giving the Ukrainians what they need here. I think to the degree this becomes a political issue, it becomes another example of the Biden White House having to be kind of dragged towards giving the Ukrainians what they've said they needed, whether it was tanks or jets or HIMARS. There's been this sort of element of like, we will give you what you want only after you really, really beg us for it. That could have a political impact, but I don't think the progressive opposition to giving Ukrainians dangerous weapons they're going to use on their own land, to defend their own territory is going to, broadly change the direction of the political debate here.
Claire, I'm convinced in the next 15 years there'll be more books written about Biden and NATO than Biden and anything in the domestic policy, just because we judge our presidencies by their foreign policy. Yet it's unlikely that success in the war accrues to his benefit, but any mistake could become a problem for him, right?
Well, and he has shown tremendous strength in terms of unifying NATO. And he will go over to NATO and he will talk to all of them and he will use his foreign policy chops and his diplomacy skills, which are really impressive. And he will smooth this over about these weapons. And I think one thing we have to remember about these weapons, first, the Democratic Armed Services Committee embrace this. So this is not going to be a huge schism in the party. And second, they're asking to use them in their own country.
Right.
They're not going to use them in another country.
Yeah.
So this is not that you're going to punish innocent civilians you're at war against. This is Ukraine deciding it is worth the risk to hold on to our country, to use these munitions to save our country.
And Brendan, Republicans would have, on the House, at least the more hawkish ones, had they not sent it, would have said, wokeness is somehow hitting the military decisions in a war.
Yeah, and I think the other important dynamic we have to keep in mind is it's not clear that there's going to be support from Congress to continue funding this war forever. Yep. And obviously, Ukraine's success in here relies in large part on the United States footing a lot of the bill. And we've already started seeing a lot of Republicans questioning whether I think there will be more money to come, but it's not forever. And I think Joe Biden is looking at this and realizing we need to win this war quickly before we run out of support back home.
So I thought that was an interesting discussion that sort of showed that last guy, he was a former advisor to like Paul Ryan and John Boehner. So he's like an establishment Republican. Brendan Buck, I think and then Claire McCaskill, she used to be a Democratic senator from Missouri. And Garrett Hake is an NBC reporter. Anyway, I thought that there was sort of the fairly wide spectrum of political opinion, though not wide enough to really get the Barbara Lee position there, I guess. But I showed you that beforehand. And they also mentioned this idea that Ukraine is running out of ammunition, which I think is part of the reason why they're sending the cluster bombs, is because they don't have enough other munitions to send. And that's something that Margaret Brennan also brings up, talking to the Ukrainian ambassador here, Oksana Markarova, who also gives, like I said earlier, the kind of what Claire McCaskill was saying, what the most dispositive answer is on the cluster bombs is that even though there are problems with cluster bombs, the unexploded bombs possibly harming civilians, years later, this is something that Ukraine is asking for to use on their own territory to try to get rid of the Russians. And so if it's hard to say it's a war crime when it's the army of Ukraine wanting to use it in the territory of Ukraine. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Your president and our president said that Ukraine's running out of ammunition. So how quickly will this latest U.S. package arrive, and how quickly will it make a difference?
Well, first of all, let me say how grateful we are to President Biden and to everyone for making this decision to provide us with this munition. I know everyone is discussing how difficult it was and sometimes even call it controversial, but there is nothing controversial about it. We are fighting on our territory, brutal enemy. There is nothing worse than tortures, rapes, and everything that Russians do on the territories they occupy, and we need to liberate as quick as possible. So we are really grateful that in times when we do need increased numbers of munitions to support our counteroffensive, that U.S. made the decision, and we really hope we will see it very quickly on the battlefield.
So these cluster munitions drop bomblets, and sometimes those bomblets don't explode right away, and years later they can be a danger. I've met victims who've been blinded and maimed in places where the U.S. dropped these decades ago. So when the White House says that Ukraine has made assurances on how it will use these, how do you do this and assure that civilians won't be hurt?
Well, first of all, let's remind where we start with. Ukraine is the most mined country now already. Russians mined everywhere. The unexploded ordnance is everywhere. So we're doing a lot of demining. And U.S., by the way, is helping us a lot in demining already now. With regard to these munitions that we will be getting from the U.S., first, they are of a much higher quality, so to start with. And second, as responsible as we are with all other American-supplied or European-supplied munitions, we are controlling it. We have a very responsible ways. We use the NATO type of log-fast system to record every unit that we have, where it is. Mm-hmm. We will use the same type of approach to this. We will know where we use it, how we used it, and of course, every time we liberate our territories, deminers are the first people that go there, try to make sure that the area is safe. So we will do exactly the same.
And I imagine Russia uses these on civilian areas. I have to imagine Ukraine has pledged not to do that and only to use them on soldiers.
Oh my God, they use this and phosphor and everything else specifically on civilian areas and destroying civilian areas.
And that's
we
the wartime
definitely
aspect.
we will not use it in civilian populated areas.
That's the war crime aspect that Russia has been criticized for on this.
So there you have it from Margaret Brennan's interview with the Ukrainian ambassador. That's the position of the Ukrainian government expressed to the American people as to why they want cluster bombs to use on their own territory and how they're going to use them to try to minimize the long-term negative effects. And you can let me think. You can let me know what you think about whether she's correct or if you're more in the Barbara Lee position. Which, like I said, I also have some sympathy for the Barbara Lee position. But this next clip I want to show you is the Wyoming Senator Republican John Barrasso on Fox News Sunday, and Shannon Bream, at least. I mean, this is why I am fairly confident in titling my video about Biden showcases successful Ukraine policy, because even on Fox News, you know, they like to criticize Biden's foreign policy as much as possible. They're still talking about the problems with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Janet Yellen apparently bowed too much to people in China, or and even in the Ukraine policy, they talk about how they try to say, you know, we're spending too much, but we're also sending stuff too slowly. And John Barrasso is the more on the side of haven't been doing stuff fast enough. He does support the cluster bombs, as you'll see in the second half of this clip. These are two parts of the interview that I edited together. First, Shannon Bream asking the only confrontational question I think in this interview, which is, at least as I would look at it from a journalistic perspective, where she points out, like I said in my the title of the video, that Biden has had a pretty good success keeping NATO unified and in managing the support of Ukraine against the Russian invasion without actually tipping over into World War III, as some people thought he was going to do or claimed he, you know, it's been a good balance, and he's done a good job unifying the NATO response and supporting Ukraine after Ukraine itself defied expectations, and or maybe it was the hollowness of the Russian army, or why exactly 500 days ago the Russian army was such a spectacular failure in its invasion of Ukraine, and that's how we got where we are. But anyway, Shannon Bream recognizes that the Biden administration has a success to showcase in its Ukraine policy, and asked John Barrasso about that. But not much, no follow-up. John Barrasso, he accepts the facts, he accepts the premise of the question, sort of, where NATO is unified. Well, but he doesn't ever say it's Biden did good. He just says, well, it's good that NATO's unified, but never really mentions how Biden had anything to do with it. Certainly in contrast to Trump, who almost had us withdrawing from NATO, as I think will be kind of clear from the final clip I show of Vladimir Zelensky talking to Martha Raddatz on ABC. But anyway, here is Shannon Bream gives no follow-up on John Barrasso refusing to give Biden credit, but then does this weird questioning of him on cluster bombs, where all of a sudden Fox News is kind of taking the Barbara Lee position. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that Fox News bias clip together over here.
President Biden has said that Putin's calculation was that when this attack on Ukraine happened, it could potentially splinter different allies and NATO, but that NATO is stronger and more unified than it has been in a very long time. Do you give President Biden any credit for keeping that coalition together, for being the leadership voice?
No, I think it's important that NATO stay together and that we act in unity, and I think NATO has to be held accountable and do more. We cannot shoulder this burden alone, nor should we. There's lots of support in Congress for Ukraine, and it's for technology, it's for weapons, it's for information. It's not for troops. The best thing we can do now is to step up, and I see the president doing that now with the cluster bombs. I support those. This should have happened long ago. Russia's been using those for a long time. It just does seem to me, Shannon, that there's so much delay in the activity of this administration in ultimately getting to Ukraine what they need, but it's taking too long. You know, the president has this misguided fear that anytime we send anything to them, it's going to just add to escalation in ways that Putin will then attack more. The Economist magazine this week reported that in the last year, the Russians, Putin, have fired 10 million. I mean, there's an astonishing number of shells into Ukraine. And by so many of these delays that we've had in this administration, I think it's just prolonged the war and added to increased death.
Do you think Ukraine should be invited to join NATO? I want to ask you quickly about the cluster munitions. Very controversial. A number of our allies have come out and said that they ban these weapons. They don't think that we need to be supplying them, the U.S., to Ukraine. Congress has had language in the defense appropriations saying that we can't send out these cluster munitions that have a dud rate higher than 1%, meaning some of these bomblets, some of the ordnance does not explode, but it's out there and somebody could happen upon it later and it could be tragic. It could be deadly for years to come. The White House says that they're going to go around essentially using the Foreign Assistance Act. It's going to go beyond what Congress has said is that 1% limit. Is it usurping your power as a lawmaker and the standard you've set for these weapons?
Well, you know, I voted against that bill back, I think it was in 2009. I support the use of these weapons. Russia's been using them all along. I think this fills a gap that the folks need in Ukraine in their battle. I wish they would have had them sooner. But, you know, right now, Shannon, the Congress, the House and the Senate are debating the National Defense Authorization Act, and that discussion will probably be part of those debates as we come to votes in Congress again.
All right, Senator Barrasso, always good to see you.
So yeah, that was the Shannon Bream interview where she at least did ask him about Biden's success in Ukraine, but then didn't follow up when he wouldn't give Biden any credit for it. And then that whole cross-examination about cluster bombs, I think makes me think of what Chuck Todd said in the panel discussion I showed a few clips ago, where like if Biden hadn't sent the cluster bombs, they on Fox News, they would have been saying it was because he had a woke military that wouldn't, violate the Barbara Lee type principles that, and of course, Barbara Lee, Fox News is not a fan of Barbara Lee, I have to say, even though I'm a fan of Barbara Lee. I think she is a principled and wise leader who has a lot of experience being an anti-war activist in the House and maybe deserves to be in the Senate. It would be nice to have the one person who voted against the authorization of use of military force in Afghanistan and anywhere in the world we want to bomb people who we say are terrorists. That's what we did in September 2001. We created this authorization for, that was the whole Obama drone program that I criticized, even though I voted for Obama, and that went from George W. Bush to Obama through Trump. All sorts of extracurricular military activities that have been authorized because Congress voted to go to war in Afghanistan in September 2001 after 9/11. And so, yeah, I like Barbara Lee, and I don't understand why Shannon Bream was like pretending to be Barbara Lee in the cross-examination of Senator Barrasso in that last clip. But anyway, this next clip, this final newsmaker clip, I think this is the clip of the week, my favorite clip. It's Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't know if this is like backlash from the whole first Trump indictment where Trump tried to strong-arm Zelensky into digging up bogus dirt on Biden and the whole Hunter Biden Burisma thing that while unseemly, doesn't actually violate any laws that I know about. But now Zelensky is being asked by Martha Raddatz over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos about this Trump claim that he could end the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 24 hours. And Zelensky says, Mike Pence even said this in an interview I saw earlier today on Fox News, where the only way to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours is to hand Ukraine over to Vladimir Putin. And that's pretty much what Vladimir Zelensky says. And he also points out that Biden could have done that and didn't do that. I think if Vladimir Zelensky could vote in the 2024 election and it was Biden versus Trump, I think he'd vote for Biden. But you can let me know what you think after we watch this final newsmaker clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos yesterday together over here.
As for future support from Americans, Zelensky is watching the U.S. elections closely, but says the choice is up to the American people.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
Donald Trump says he would end the war in 24 hours if he was elected president.
It seems to me that their sole desire to bring the war to an end is beautiful, but this desire should be based on some real-life experience. Well, it looks as if Donald Trump had already these 24 hours once in his time. We were at war, not a full-scale war, but we were at war, and as I assume, he had that time at his disposal. But he must have had some other priorities. If we are talking about ending the war at the cost of Ukraine, in other words, to make us give up our territories, well, I think in this way Biden could have brought it to an end even in 5 minutes. But we would not agree.
So I don't know if, what do you think? Am I overinterpreting that clip from Zelensky? I mean, he's talking about how even during the Trump administration, Russia was occupying a large part of Ukraine. Since 2014, Russia's been occupying the Donbass region and, of course, took over the whole Crimean Peninsula. So President Zelensky has a point there. And I don't know, even if he wasn't going so far as to say that Trump would hand Ukraine over to Putin in 24 hours if he became president, I did still see there that the president of Ukraine seems to have a preference for President Joe Biden over a possible re-elected President Donald Trump. I mean, the intro there from Martha Raddatz said that Zelensky said it's up to the American people to decide, but that's just obviously true. It doesn't tell you who Zelensky prefers, and you tell me what you think from that clip. I'm pretty sure it's Joe Biden. But anyway, that's the final newsmaker clip. That's the end of the program for this LiberalViewer Monday Media Mix-Up for July 10th. It's episode 110. I've been doing this 110 weeks in a row. I'll keep doing it all the way through the 2024 election, and actually I promised all the way through January 2025, because as we know, the election's not over till January 6, 2025, or whenever, the Congress has to certify the votes. So anyway, this was more of a foreign policy show. I don't know what the topic's going to be next week, or if I'll have some reason to upload some other video in the next week. I'm trying to think of ways to increase the content I create, maybe do some more edited, produced videos, or maybe creating like some excerpts from my Monday Media Mix-Ups. Stay tuned to hear more about that. But otherwise, I'll see you every Monday all the way through January 2025. And until next Monday, or until I have some reason to upload some other kind of video, I guess I will just be seeing all of you around the internet.